Well, we're glad to have you all back with us for our next presentation. Uh, Today, we're going to be talking about the state budget, not the federal budget, which looks a lot better than what we just heard, as well as some of those COVID-19 relief dollars. And Alex Adams with DFM, the executive director of DFM, is here with us today. Um, just to let all of you know, and I know most of you or many of you know Alex. He's been there now, appointed by the governor for a couple of years as a budget and regulatory chief for the Idaho Division of Financial Management. The division has been working extraordinarily hard since both he's been there. The governor had right out of the chute the Red Tape Reduction Act, cutting 75% of our red tape, providing vital information related to revenue projections, and in this sort of 100-year occurrence with the pandemic, has been instrumental in the use, the focus, and the distribution of the COVID-19 Relief Fund, which is, as noted in our prior presentation, has been instrumental to part of Idaho's recovery. So today, Alex is going to go over some of those relief funds being utilized and give us a sense of what they're working with and looking at it as a state revenue picture. And with that, I'd like to introduce Alex Adams and appreciate him being here with us today in studio.
Well, certainly, thank you, Miguel. It's always a great conference, unique circumstances this year, so I appreciate the alacrity with which you all were able to pull this conference off and hopefully make it a successful one. In terms of talking about the state budget, it's certainly interesting to follow Mark's presentation on the federal budget. He provided quite a bit of context for some of the uncertainty that we've been dealing with since March. But in particular, as you noted, Miguel, it sets up a nice contrast of how Idaho is different. And Idaho might be weathering the storm a little bit better and differently than other states. And what I was hoping to do is provide a little bit of context for some of the headlines that you might be seeing. So, thinking through how to structure this presentation, I was going to focus on two topics. The first is how Governor Little has been managing the uncertainty of the fiscal year 21 budget. Many of you know, but for those of you who don't know, Idaho fiscal year runs July 1 through June 30th. So we're currently in the fiscal year 21 budget. So I'll talk a little bit about the audibles that we've had to call. Second topic is how we're preparing for the fiscal year 22 budget. Governor Little's making some of his final recommendations on that budget. This is the budget that he would deliver to this legislature in January as part of his State of the State and budget address. And well, I don't think it'll be a surprise to anybody who's come to ATI in the past. I'm certainly not going to scoop my boss, who will be here later today, and certainly won't get out ahead of the State of the State presentation. But I'll talk a little bit about some of the decision points, some of the things that have been on the governor's mind as he puts together what might be one of the more unique budgets in state history. So, with that, in terms of talking about how we manage the uncertainty of the 2021 budget, I think it's important to know where we started with the 2021 budget. When the legislature adjourned on in March, these were the high level numbers. And I certainly want to give my thanks and credit to JFAC co chairs Bear and Youngblood, all of JFAC and legislative leadership. They left town with a structurally balanced budget, a budget that rebuilt our rainy day funds, made critical investments in K 12, specifically teacher pay. And they did so while leaving a balanced budget with $55 million as an ending balance, or a surplus, so to speak. And if you look at the line that says total revenues, budget was built generally around the revenue forecast that DFM brought in January. DFM brings a revenue forecast in January. The legislature has a panel called the Economic Outlook and Revenue Assessment Committee. They do their own work. And the two were within $3 million of each other, which is just remarkable in a $4 billion budget. But you can see the budget was based around a projected revenue of 4.1 billion. So in looking at the revenue forecast, Wanted to talk a little bit about how that's evolved. Similar to Mark, he showed a big drop off with COVID. Obviously, the difference between the state and the federal government is the state has a constitutional obligation to have a balanced budget, and we also do not print our own money. So, this was the forecast that we brought in January. And you can see in the current year we're in, we had projected, and looks like the numbers are cut off a little bit on my screen. Hopefully others can see them, but those should all start with four. So you can see in 2021, we were at 4.1 billion, and we had four consecutive years of year over year growth, growing to an estimated general fund revenue of 4.7 billion in 2024. This is just the general fund forecast. When you think of the Idaho General Fund, it's very heavy on individual income tax and sales tax. Between those two, that accounts for just under 90% of our general fund. And I think everybody listening to this knows the volatility of sales tax and income tax in times of great stress like this. And one of the challenges of revenue forecasting, even in normal times, is you're trying to predict the future. And Derek Santos, our chief economist, always says, forecasting is like trying to drive a car forward using only your rear view mirror. And even in normal times, it's a pretty difficult process. But these are not normal times, and we relied on a lot of national estimates, national forecasts, and throughout the spring, we were forecasting frequently as new inputs were coming about, and we got a little bit more information. But when COVID hit, you had the shutdown, you had a slowing of consumer confidence. And the first forecast we produced was what I refer to here as the April forecast. It's the red line. And you can see in fiscal year 2021, there was an immediate drop off of $350 million from where we had set a structurally balanced budget. And you can see we predicted year over year growth, albeit never getting back to the levels that we had previously predicted, and we weren't likely to cross the line that we had budgeted for in 21 until fiscal year 23. So it was at this point that it became abundantly clear to us that we had to start taking actions to ensure we could deliver that constitutionally balanced budget. And the governor issued a memo shortly after this internal forecast had been produced, asking agencies to start preparing for a holdback in fiscal 21. A holdback is a reduction in spending. And certainly, relatively speaking, the earlier a holdback is announced, the easier it is for an agency to prepare again, knowing that easier is a relative term. But it gives agencies a chance to think through how to put together a plan that's going to least disrupt service delivery to Idahoans. If they were going to purchase a bunch of new things, it gives them a chance to not do that and perhaps use that as some of their savings. So it was important to the governor to get word out to the agencies as early as possible in this process so that they were maximally prepared and were able to accomplish any potential spending reduction with least impact on Idahoans. And a couple things. This forecast, the April forecast, was really the one that led us to pull the trigger on making some tough decisions. And it reminded me, though, of the old story of the optimist and the pessimist. You get a forecast like this that's 350 million below forecast. We also had a more pessimistic scenario that was 597 million below forecast. And you look at this, from the optimistic and the pessimistic lens. The pessimist says this is awful; it can't get any worse, and the optimist says, "Oh yes, it can." And the optimist was right. When we forecasted in May, we saw another drop off in projected revenue for fiscal year 21. This time, it was 459 million below where we had set the budget under the weighted average forecast. And if you look at the more pessimistic forecast that we had at the time, it was closer to 700 million, 695 million to be exact. So we were staring down the barrel of a pretty substantial, uh, deficit, and had to account for that mid-year. And if you ask me why the April and the May forecasts were that far off and why May was more pessimistic, even at the weighted average than April, it was for a couple reasons. One, uh, in April, we were on the shutdown and started to reemerge in May. And there's considerable uncertainty about consumer confidence and how quickly consumers would reemerge and what that would mean in terms of their consumption. And also, if you look at our unemployment rate in April, that was the month that it had jumped to 11.8%. And there was considerable uncertainty about how long that would last, how quickly that would rebound, when that number would come down. And when you have risk with consumer confidence and consumption, and risk with unemployment, and those are your two biggest sources of general fund revenue, uh, not surprising to see forecasts like this. So you take those forecasts, specifically the May forecast, you plug it into that beautiful budget that our legislature had passed and enacted upon sine die. You plug in the new revenue, and rather than having a surplus of $55 million, we had a potential deficit of $392 million. And that meant we had to make up a minimum of $392 million just to break even. And again, this was on the weighted average side. There were more pessimistic forecasts that we were grappling with. So, when thinking through how to deal with a revenue gap, you have four primary options. And spent quite a bit of time earlier this year talking to Governor Little about each of these options, when to pull the levers, how hard to pull each of these levers. But there's essentially four levers you can pull. The first is raising taxes. And it should warm Miguel's heart to know that this was never seriously considered as an option and was frankly never seriously discussed as an option. So that left three levers that could be credibly pulled. First is using rainy day funds. Uh, we, as a state, uh, again, certainly kudos to our legislature for their judicious and prudent actions in recent years in strategically rebuilding those rainy day funds four times like these. We're sitting at just under $600 million in our rainy day funds. And if you look at that as a percentage of our budget, that would place Idaho in the top 10 states nationwide in terms of rainy day fund coverage for four times like these. A lot of the discussions we had was how we use those rainy day funds during the last recession. And in general, you try to meter them out over time. As I showed you, even under that April forecast, it was unlikely we were going to rebound above our fiscal year 21 level until fiscal year 23. So naturally, a tendency to just jump to the rainy days. It seems like the path of least resistance. But with 600 million in the deficits we were looking at, we were thinking it would be a 3 to 4 year proposition to meter out the rainy days strategically. And oftentimes you see federal funding coming at the beginning of these crises and dipping off. So we wanted to preserve as much of those rainy day funds for the out years as possible. Your next option is cutting spending. Governor Little did pull this lever. We asked agencies to prepare for a 5% holdback. We asked them to do so starting in March, and he officially issued that on July 1 of this year. That meant agencies' budgets were fixed by the legislature, and then agencies would spend 5% less than that level. That was across the board. In getting to that amount, that's approximately $195 million. So that got us about halfway to where we thought we needed to be. And the intention was to use rainy days and federal funds to the extent they became available to get us the rest of the way to making up that gap. In thinking through how to trim spending, a couple thoughts. A lot of the discussions we had was we knew that there would be federal funds coming into the state, and to the extent allowable under law, we would use those federal funds to backfill state general fund spending cuts. So it wasn't just a matter of cutting agency budgets, it was strategically doing so, knowing we would have the availability of federal funds to backfill some of those cuts. The other thing is COVID is unique relative to most recessions, and that it meant in many instances that expenses are down at most if not all agencies. And a lot of agency budgets have operating costs for travel to out of state conferences, travel in state. For better or worse, very few of those things occurred this year. Similarly, we saw a substantial shift in criminal justice policy, and we have fewer inmates in our system, 1,000 fewer than we did at the high watermark in March. That led to some cost savings there. The feds are covering a greater share of our Medicaid expenses than they do in normal times. So, in general, agencies' expenses were down. We had federal funds to cover some of those variable costs. So, at one point, we had 67% of the state workforce working from home. That meant there were increased needs for laptops, desktops, VPN access, cybersecurity needs, things like that. And we've been able to strategically leverage those federal funds to cover those variable costs while the agency facilities aren't operating. So, cutting spending was a chance to bottle those two phenomenons: lower expenses, increased federal funds. And then the last option to help close a revenue gap is leveraging federal funds. And as Mark had noted, there's been quite a bit of federal programs that have been created. The one that I'm going to spend the most of my time on is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. That's the $1.25 billion that Idaho received. So, under the Coronavirus Relief Fund, it did have three specific conditions. A state could only use it for expenses that were incurred due to the public health emergency. They couldn't have been accounted for in the budget most recently enacted, and they have to be incurred from March 1 through December 30th. And expressly, they cannot be used for revenue replacement. So, if one of our levers to pull is backfilling lost revenue with federal funds, that was specifically foreclosed in the Coronavirus Relief Fund. So, we had to get creative in how we used it. And in talking through how to use it, one of the governor's top priorities was getting as much of this funding out to Idaho's small businesses and Idaho citizens as possible. Other states rushed to cover as much of their government expenses as they could. Our approach was getting as much of this out into our economy as possible. So I'll highlight just a couple of the things that Governor Little and his CFAC committee have done with these federal funds. But the largest category of what we've done was what we call small business support. We had made small business grants available to businesses with 50 or fewer employees, including sole proprietors, and really tried to target it to businesses that had fallen through the cracks of some of the federal programs, specifically those that didn't get PPP loans. If you remember early in the pandemic when there was pretty substantially limited PPP loans, businesses like the Los Angeles Lakers were able to secure some of those loans, but a lot of Main Street businesses in Kamei and Bear Lake were not successful during that first round. So we got those grants out there to fill in some of those cracks. Uh, what we also did was we made personal protective equipment available to small businesses. When the economy started to reopen in early May, there was such a backlog for masks, gloves, and sanitizer, and some of those critical PPE products that they had to be purchased in such quantities that it just wasn't feasible for small businesses. So our Department of Administration stood up a program where we bought PPE in bulk and made it available to small businesses, either at cost or at no cost for those who were not in a position to afford it. And we think that was a critical step in getting some of those tools out to businesses and giving consumers confidence in their ability to reemerge in our economy. The other thing we did was after the grant program ended, the amount that we had remaining, we put in the unemployment insurance trust fund. That hopefully was something that was of interest to ATI and its membership. And why that was important was for two reasons. That restored what had been withdrawn from our unemployment insurance trust fund as we saw record spikes in unemployment across the state. But importantly, what it also did beyond solvency is the amount that is in that fund on September 30th is the amount that determines taxes that businesses pay into that system in the subsequent year. And by putting that money into the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund, Governor Little ensured that most Idaho businesses will actually see a tax cut under the rates that you'll pay next year. One of the other things we did, and this was pretty important to Governor Little early in the pandemic, was ensuring all Idaho local governments had the support they needed to get through COVID. He knew that there was going to be some real impact on counties and county jails. He knew there was going to be real impact on cities, especially those with police forces and others. And we made quite a bit of money available to local governments to ensure that they had the resources necessary to cover their increased costs. And one of the specific programs that we created for local governments was called the Governor's Public Safety Initiative. Had two goals. Primary goal was to ensure that our public safety officials, specifically police, fire, EMS, were fully covered during the pandemic, and that cities didn't have to look at furloughs or other cost reductions with our critical public safety personnel. So, Governor covered a substantial fraction of public safety budgets for those local governments. If those local governments then agreed to pass those resulting savings on to their taxpayers in the form of property tax relief. And all told, through that program, Governor Little got $126 million out to back our blue, to defend our police, and in so doing, resulted in savings for Idaho property taxpayers throughout the state. Hopefully, many of your members were able to see that on their statements that came out at the end of November. Couple other things we did: prioritize the safe reopening of schools, ensured they had testing for teachers and school personnel, ensured they had PPE, especially the plexiglass that was needed. This is one of those areas where it's an example of the governor being able to not only restore the cuts that we did on the state general fund side, but make substantial new investments above and beyond the budget that had been set by the legislature upon sine die. So we put $220 million towards the safe reopening of schools. A subcomponent of that, we launched a program called Strong Families, Strong Students. And we knew that parents across the state were hurting, especially those that had remote learning environments. Many of them had to make alternative arrangements, send their kids off to a facility, create pods, things like that. And it was important to the governor that he targeted resources to families so that they could cover those costs associated with ensuring our students can continue to learn during these trying times. And the last thing I was going to note about how we've used these federal funds was we did put $50 million towards broadband infrastructure, and that's going to lead to improvements from Aberdeen to Winchester. And essentially, during the pandemic, we've seen record use of telehealth. Telehealth increased 4,000%. Record use of remote working. We had 67% of the state workforce teleworking at one point. We've also seen record use of distance education, and it was important to ensure that all corners of the state were able to access broadband and engage in all of those activities remotely. So, again, one of the levers you can pull is using federal funds. We were foreclosed from using those federal funds to backfill our lost revenue directly. So we tried to get as much of it out in the economy as possible, cover not just the public infrastructure costs necessary with combating the pandemic, but help out small businesses, help out Idahoans in the form of property tax relief, ensure our schools were fully filled. And we were able to offset a lot of the state general fund cuts by leveraging these strategically and within the guidance by Treasury. So go back to the revenue forecast, showed you the delta of what we were dealing with. Things rebounded over the summer. And, we had seen unemployment spike to 11.8%, and then it came down to the 5% range over the summer. The federal aid packages that Mark spoke in depth about led to substantial amount of federal aid coming into the state, and really shifted how personal income is seen in Idaho. A substantial fraction became transfer payments from the federal government. We saw a lot of stimulus checks coming into the state. So when we forecasted in August, which is one of our official forecasts, and it came up substantially. You can see it as the black line here. It didn't. It rebounded to just below the line that the budget had been set by the legislature. And, that's attributable to all of those federal aid packages. It turns out if you send everybody stimulus checks, you sell a lot of bicycles and kayaks and other things like that. And our sales tax not only rebounded, we started seeing it come in stronger. So this chart shows you our general fund collections. The white bars show you the forecast. The forecast is based on that August line I just showed you. The black bars show you our actual revenue collections. And you can see every month this year, July, August, September, October, we've exceeded our forecast in terms of collections. And it's really been driven by both income tax and sales tax. And, in general, withholding, income tax withholding is our best real time indicator of how our state's economy is doing. In each and every month this fiscal year, we have exceeded our income tax withholding forecasts. And, spoiler alert, next week we'll put out our November numbers. I've seen the November numbers. And when we put those out, we'll certainly encourage you to be sitting down when you see those, because if you look at income tax withholding relative to forecast, as well as year over year growth, you're going to see really robust income tax withholding in the month of November, just as we've seen up until this point. So collectively, uh, the revenue forecast rebounding, and then us being in a position where our actual collections are exceeding those forecasts, we're now in a surplus position again. And there's been considerable news about Idaho being in a surplus position. You might have seen headlines about us having a $587 million surplus. When you add in November, it'll be over $600 million. That would be the largest surplus in state history. So again, it's been a very unique year. It set a great budget. Legislature did a tremendous job with a budget, most conservative since 14. Saw a predicted large drop off, had to take actions, pulling the levers of leveraging federal funds to the extent allowable, planning to use rainy days, and then trimming spending. And then we saw things rebound, and we're now in a surplus position. And heard quite a bit of exuberance about the surplus. Based on the calls I've gotten, that surplus has been spent at least 3 times over. So I thought it would be worth spending a little bit of time uh, going through what I called the anatomy of the surplus, making sure people understand not just why we have a surplus, but where it's coming from. And it's not all on revenue collections. In fact, very little of this surplus is on revenue collections. When you look at the breakdown of it, 131 million of it is because we ended fiscal year 20 stronger than we had thought. So we rolled over 131 million from last year's budget, more so than had been budgeted by the legislature. And if you look at why we had 131 million more, a large fraction of that was spending reductions at the end of fiscal year 20. A lot of spending occurs at the end of the fiscal year. People pre buy paper and ink and other things like that. We prevented that this year. We had a hiring freeze at the end of fiscal year 20. We had a compensation freeze at the end of 20. So we saw a lot more reversions at the end of fiscal year 20 than is normal. So a lot of that was trim spending. The component of that surplus from 20 that was attributable to revenue was attributable to income tax filing that was stronger than projected. Of course, income tax filings in fiscal year 20 were based on what happened in calendar year 2019, which may or may not be a good barometer of things moving forward. So I think it's safest to treat this portion of the surplus as one time. We also, after the end of the fiscal year, brought $60 million back. Some of the agencies that have a lot of federal spending in particular, it takes them some time to close out their books, and then they revert money in this calendar year. We got $60 million back from Medicaid. And why Medicaid came in under budget and was able to give 60 million back. In round numbers, the feds usually cover about 70% of our general fund, or excuse me, of our Medicaid budget. They cover 70% of our Medicaid budget. During the pandemic, they're covering 76% of that. So they're covering 6% more of our Medicaid cost than in a normal year, and that led to $60 million of savings. This is short term. That is scheduled to expire soon. So, barring federal action, this should be viewed as one-time savings. And same story, different verse with this. In the current year budget, Medicaid submitted supplementals. The net of all supplementals is $29 million of savings to the state general fund. Again, that's primarily because the feds are covering a larger share of our Medicaid costs, which allows us to bring that back into the general fund. We already talked about the spending reductions. This was the governor's 5% across the board holdback. We were able to strategically replace much of this with the use of the federal funds, and it was also offset by those agencies' decreased expenses. But the spending reductions adds to that surplus number. We're 117 million ahead of the revenue forecast. This is what you see on the previous slide, where the actuals are exceeding forecast. And then lastly, when the legislature left town, as I mentioned, they had planned on an ending balance of 55 million. They had planned on leaving a surplus. So when you add all of these together, that's how you get to 587 million. But again, a couple things to reinforce. The portion of this that's most likely the ongoing portion is the revenues, the portion that currently says 117 million more than budgeted, and that's but a fraction of the surplus. And we're spending quite a bit of time trying to figure out how much of the revenue being ahead of forecast is truly ongoing versus one time. The stimulus checks that were sent out earlier this year were a one time deal. Those led to a lot of sales and propped up our sales tax actual receipts above our forecast. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect that will continue. Some of the unemployment benefits that Mark talked about. He talked about the extra 600 a week. That was part of those benefits. That has since expired, and we don't have that to rely on in terms of helping with our sales tax and consumption moving forward. And partly why we're ahead is income tax filings in July were much stronger than forecast, and that's kind of a function of timing. We had moved income tax filings from April 15th to June 15th, and some of that bled across fiscal years. So I think our approach to this surplus is optimistic, but cautiously so. And I think you're going to see the governor as he approaches his budget, both for 21 and 22 with a double dose of caution. So with that, I talked a bit about the uncertainty of managing the 21 budget, and I'll now turn to some of the questions on the governor's mind as he prepares for the fiscal year 22 budget. And a couple of the questions: what's the COVID trajectory going to look like? It's pretty clear that cases are not going in a direction that we would hope that they would be going. And the governor talks often about health and the economy being critically linked. And if we can't get these cases under control, we will have a revenue impact similar to what we were forecasting earlier this year. If consumer consumption slows, if businesses start closing, we will have a real impact. And trying to predict which direction the novel coronavirus will go has injected considerable uncertainty into this. And even though we are sitting on a surplus this year, again, that's based on a forecast. I now know the numbers through November, but we still have a long runway ahead of us. And our two biggest revenue months of the year are April and June. Those cards aren't on the table. So we're preparing a budget against a pretty uncertain backdrop. The other piece we're dealing with is the coronavirus relief funds. We've held on to quite a bit of it. We know there's going to be public health infrastructure costs that cross years, testing, tracing, costs at our veterans' homes, things like that. And currently, those funds are set to expire on December 30th of this year, barring congressional action. If Congress extends the use of those funds, we'll be able to offset quite a few of those public health costs moving forward. If Congress does not extend the use of those funds, we have to build those costs into the budget. These weren't costs that had been contemplated last year, and there's considerable uncertainty about the availability of federal funding beyond December 30th. As we already talked about, how much of our revenue is one time due to record federal spending levels versus ongoing revenue? It's a difficult question to ask and answer. And it's one I know our economists have been spending considerable time trying to diagnose. And we're close to finalizing our forecast that will be the basis of our January 2021 forecast. And I think we've gotten close to having more comfort in our answer on this question. A couple other things. I know you have a panel that's going to be discussing tax conformity. Uh, there are quite a few tax changes as part of the CARES Act and other federal action. And it does lead to a larger than normal fiscal note, and that has to be accounted for as a part of the governor's budget. So I think when people hear surplus, they start putting together a list of grandiose new ideas when there are a lot of expenses like tax conformity that we have to prepare for. And my guess is the panel will go in a lot more depth of what some of the key ingredients of conformity are. One thing to know, though, is I wouldn't necessarily look at this dollar amount. So this is split over 2 years, 55 this year, 42 next, based on our estimates. And I wouldn't necessarily look at this as a loss of revenue so much as the bulk of that is moving revenue losses from out years to this year to help businesses with liquidity in the short term. So we're either going to pay for these now or pay for it later in general, but it does have a cost that we have to account for in a budget that already has quite a bit of uncertainty associated with it. One of the other things that has some uncertainty is the cost of Medicaid expansion. In 2018, there was a Milliman forecast that was used as the basis for the budget the past 2 years. And it's now clear that appears to have under forecast the costs of Medicaid expansion. An update that I've seen, and there's some nuance to this, but the update that I've seen is for the first full 2 years of implementation, so fiscal year 21 and 22, Medicaid expansion total costs are now projected to be 660 million above forecast. Now, Medicaid expansion has a 90-10 cost share, so approximately 66 million of that would hit the state general fund. And there's again nuances with receipt authority, other things like that. So that doesn't translate dollar to dollar what Medicaid's budget request is in this year. But there are considerable new costs that we have to figure out how to cover. There was quite a bit of exuberance in the early days that offsets to other state programs would fully cover the cost of expansion, and it appears that that is not the case based on this new forecast. And there's quite a few decision points of thinking through how this could be covered. And then, just one other thing, and looking at the 22 budget, I know ATI was actively involved in these conversations, many of your members, but 2 years ago, there was a bill that passed that collected sales tax from internet retailers and marketplace facilitators. And rather than that going through the traditional sales tax distribution formula and hitting the general fund, it was put in a specific fund called the Tax Relief Fund. And since that wasn't leveraged this year, right now through the end of October, it's built up a one-time balance of $125 million, and it will continue to grow. I think in November it's projected to grow another 11 million, give or take, on the preliminary numbers. So you'll see this continue to grow. And how could that be used? How could that be used to help with some of the impacts that we're seeing to Idahoans and other consumers? So that's a preview of some of the questions that we're asking as we finalize this budget. Of course, can't get ahead of the state, but certainly look forward to any questions that Miguel, you or your members might have, and certainly welcome any follow-up emails. So with that, we'll go to questions.
Yeah, Alex, thank you. That was a great presentation, an overview of putting what is a very complex experience and time and effort and energy that you and others have put in this year into a 40-minute presentation is quite a task. So thanks to all of you, the governor's office and others that were involved. I understand how much work it's been. One question, maybe as a follow-up, you mentioned the one-time buildup in the tax relief fund. Do you have an estimate for the ongoing annual amount to come from that fund?
So forecasting the ongoing is a little bit difficult because you also have to figure out how much of the consumer behavior has shifted online will continue versus will come back to traditional brick and mortar retailers. But I think right now our best estimate for the ongoing portion of the tax relief fund is around $90 million would be ongoing into that fund.
Okay, no, that's useful. I have a similar question here, but I think that answered both. My friend Wayne Hammond from the Associated General Contractors asks, okay, that's a magic word, surplus. Any plans to use the one-time money for necessary infrastructure improvements?
uh, so
You're
uh,
welcome, Wayne.
so for folks that don't know, Wade was in my position. He was the last recession era DFM administrator. And Wayne, I appreciate how much you have given me guidance throughout this process. I've spent quite a bit of time going through the old Hammond file, and many of the levers we've had to pull, we learned from your experiences. So I appreciate that, Wayne. Like I said, when I went through the surplus, much of the surplus is one time. Traditionally, you invest one time money in one time projects, roads, bridges, water infrastructure, all things the governor has mentioned without getting ahead of his state of the state. He's been clear at public press conferences. He would like to use this surplus for one time projects like roads and bridges. And we're uh, planning a budget accordingly, but there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. To hit that surplus number, we still have to meet all of our numbers the rest of the year, including the two biggest months, April and June. And as the governor is fond of saying, health and the economy are intricately linked. If we can't get the COVID case count and caseload under control, uh, that surplus you're going to see start to come down. And that's why we have to just build in different layers of uncertainty into this budget.
That's a great answer, Alex. And one other question, we kind of touched upon this as well, but um, beyond December 31st, any expectations in round two, CARES Act 2, of funds being utilized or expectations of funds that we may have post December 31st?
Sure. So, I guess I learned many birthdays ago, it's better to be surprised than disappointed. So, when we approach this budget, frankly, our forecast for January is presuming that there's no congressional action, that there's no additional federal funds that are coming in. Now, perhaps Congress will surprise us. I mean, I think there's two different components to look at. First is we already have coronavirus relief fund. As of today, we have 199 million that's completely unallocated, unspent, and then we have other programs that are underspent that could come back. If we have to use those by December 30th, you'll see probably a lot of that go to the unemployment insurance trust to help us lower taxes in the subsequent year as well there. However, if Congress extends the duration on the use of those funds, you'll see us put quite a bit of that towards public health infrastructure needs in next year, and perhaps work with the legislature on other programs, maybe more small business support. In terms of what will happen at Congress, as Mark said, there's quite a bit of discussion, but we're building this budget for Idaho to be self sufficient. We're building the budget for it to balance regardless of if there's additional federal action. And frankly, I think that makes us unique, and that's why I'm pretty excited about the budget in this environment that the governor is being able to operate in. I think the decisions he made early in this pandemic have set us up to be one of the only states, uh, to answer Wayne's question again, that are even in a position to discuss leveraging one-time surplus for one-time projects. When I talk to my fellow budget directors across the country, most of them are going to be coming into their legislative session in January playing Jenga, seeing how much of their budget they can push out without the entire infrastructure of state government crumbling down. So we're in a unique position. That's a credit to the decisions Governor Little has made to put us into this position. It's a credit to the years of conservative governance of our legislature. And again, it's just such a different experience than what other states are going to have.
Well, Alex, I think that's a great note to end on. Um, it is, in frankly, I still find it incredible the position that Idaho is in relative to, I would say, in most cases, any other state in the union. And it's an amazing position to be in. And thanks to the governor, to your office, to all the organizations involved, the people involved to get us here, and the hard work and the hard decisions. And thank you so much for spending the time here today to express that to our members and legislators and public officials around the state. So with that, thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you, Miguel, and have a good conference.
Appreciate it. We're going to take a momentary, actually, we're going to take about a 15-minute break right now and begin our next session at about 10:20. So thank you very much.